Bula, this is Culden Kamea for Teivovo Rugby. Welcome to my second interview with Barry Sweetman. Barry first came to Fiji from New Zealand in the 1960s as a young lawyer, and we covered his early life here around rugby in Lautoka, and then later with Fiji Rugby Union after he moved to live and work in Suva in episode 1. Barry Sweetman is a life member of the Fiji Rugby Union, a former Senator of Fiji, Chairman of the Fiji Electoral Commission, Chairman of the Fiji Electoral Boundaries Commission, and Chairman of the Constitutional Officers Commission. He was awarded the 50th Anniversary Independence Commemorative Medal in 2020 and the Officer of the Order of Fiji, OF. This interview focuses on Barry's recollections of great games and players from the late 1960s through to the early 1980s. Over to you, Barry.
Yes, Colin. Well, I had sort of a role already with Fiji Rugby in the sense that I was a West selector, but moving to the East side I had to give that away. But I was asked if I would become a member of the executive committee of the Fiji Union, and I was elected onto that in 1971. I think it was my first year. At that time, Pat Raddick was the chairman, Derek Robinson was the secretary, and a few other people that I was closely associated with, like Inoki Tamulevu. They were also on the committee. But my first role was really just as a committee man. But I was also asked if I would become a national selector, having been the I actually was already a national selector, I think. I had been made a national selector in 1970 when I was still in the West. So I just continued my role as a national selector. That was a 3-year appointment in those days. You were a national selector for 3 years, then it came up for consideration again. And I actually had my term extended three times, so I did 9 years. But that was on the selection side. On the admin side, I was assistant secretary under Derek for a year, and I then ultimately took over Derek's role as secretary of the union. And by 1973, having had a couple of years there, Pat Raddick had decided that he was going to toss his hat in the ring and give up his role as chairman. So the chairman's role became vacant, and there was an election of the Fiji Rugby Union for that role. I seem to recall that I remember Tom Vitlavoni, I think, stood against me, and it may have just been a contest between Tom and myself. It could have been another, but I was elected as chairman at that time, and took up my role as chairman of the union in 1973. That role was later on extended a couple of times through to about 1983. So I had about 10 years altogether as chairman.
Also George Pickering was the treasurer.
Yeah, those guys were extraordinarily hard-working people. It's probably hard for people to envisage this, but we were running a national union. We were organising competitions not just locally amongst the major unions, but amongst the minor unions. We were organising international rugby and tours inwards and outwards, and we had but one paid employee. That was a lady whose name I can't just remember offhand, but she was our sort of typist in the office. We didn't even have an office of our own. We had a space at the Northern Hotel's office down in the Queensland Arcade, just the corner of their office, where our girl sat with our typewriter, which was the only asset of the of the union, apart from a few smelly jerseys and a few rugby balls. And the union was effectively run by its chairman and its secretary and its treasurer. I don't think anyone would question that at the time, that the running of the Fiji Rugby Union, although there was an executive committee which included other people, they were helpful in the sense we could give them jobs of looking after this or that, might be looking after gear or looking after grounds or so on. But the spade work was essentially done by three people, and we allocated that out. Initially, between myself and Derek, I tended to handle correspondence with New Zealand because they were people I knew better, and probably also with Australia. And Derek was handling it at the IRB level and at the level of the home unions, England, Wales, Ireland and so on. So that's the way we split up the responsibilities there. This was a fascination to me because I'd never been involved in rugby at the international level. I'd had a bit of involvement in New Zealand as club secretary for Grammar Old Boys for a number of years, and I got to understand the club set up in Auckland and how it worked, and to some extent how New Zealand rugby worked. But I knew not that much about international rugby per se. So Derek was someone who had a little more knowledge in that respect than I had, because he had been with the union since the 1960s. He had been very involved in the organisation of the 1964 tour of Wales, when Fiji toured Wales on its first major tour. That was something that could be attributed almost directly to Derek. It wouldn't have happened had it not been for Derek. Similarly, of Wales playing here in 1968, you can attribute that to Derek. And to some extent, I think you could also attribute to him the All Blacks coming here, although I might have been able to give it a little bit of gentle nudging on the background on that. But Derek was absolutely vital to our international relations over that period of time, through the 60s to 70s. And gradually, I think I took over that role. Certainly, once Derek migrated out of Fiji in the what it would have been about the mid-1970s, I think. Not quite sure when Derek left. Setatui never became secretary, and a very good secretary too. And Tui and I, again, we tended to share the correspondence in particular. He took quite a load of correspondence off me, but I tended to retain the connections at the top level with my fellow chairman. And of course, looking at New Zealand and Australia at that time, the two chairmen, Cess Blasey was chairman of the New Zealand Rugby Union, and Sir Nicholas Shahady was president. The president was their top person rather than chairman. He was head of the Australian Rugby Union, and both Cess and Nick, I call him Nick, although he was really Sir Nicholas. He was Nick to me, and it always was Nick. They were extremely good friends, not only personally, but friends of Fiji Rugby. And whenever I was in need, or I felt that we needed some assistance from Australia or New Zealand, I simply had to go to them. Sometimes it wasn't always to Cess Blasey. It was later to people like Ron Don, who had been very close to me in Auckland, and was by then in a very influential position on the New Zealand Rugby Union Council. So Ron was a prime mover in New Zealand to getting any tours arranged whether inward tours to New Zealand from Fiji or outward tours from New Zealand to Fiji. Nick and there was a guy called John Dedrick, who was Secretary of the Australian Rugby Union, another great guy, a great friend of Fiji Rugby, always helpful. Their treasurer was another guy who was extremely helpful. So we had this huge help from Australia and New Zealand, which I was so relieved to have. Whenever we needed help, whether it was with refereeing, whether it was in coaching, say, could you give us some referees for a coaching session? No problem at all, Barry. Could you give us some people to help with a coaching session? No problem at all, we'll send them up. And it was just a matter of asking and we would get.
Yes.
So that was the relationship we had.
Yes.
And I felt early on, particularly after the success of the UK tours of UK tour of 1970 and the New Zealand tour of 70, that we could do this. We were in demand. We could play the sort of rugby, we showed that in 1970 against the Barbarians. We could play the sort of rugby that was in demand and people wanted to see. And so we were not short on invitations.
Yeah.
New Zealand wanted to have us, Australia wanted to have us, UK wanted to have us again, and so on. So again, it was all very well to say they'd want us, but to arrange the finance, the everything that goes with the arrangements for a long-term tour, it was something that we really didn't have all the wherewithal for. In those days, I'm not quite sure what the arrangements are. Modern day rugby, now that it's professional, probably everyone has to stand on their own feet. But in those good old amateur days, the general rule was that if you were going to host a team from, say, Australia or New Zealand, they would get themselves here. New Zealand said they'll get themselves here. And we had to pick up the tab from the time they arrived to the time they left. In other words, all expenses here, food, accommodation, transport, etc., was on the Rugby Union, but they paid to get them here. That was the rule in the early days. I think that changed later a bit.
You kept the gate.
We kept the gates.
Yes.
And of course, keeping the gates was the critical thing. And if we could get a good gate,
Yes.
which we could always do out of the All Blacks or the Wallabies, we could more than cover the expenses of the tour. We have a little bit left over. And in fact, in the early 1970s, after we'd had, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. It didn't happen until the 1980s. But by the 1980s, we had gradually built up a bit of a credit with the bank, or at least we had a better relationship with our bank. We had a few dollars there instead of wanting to borrow money all the time. We had a few cents or dollars to put in. And we had a situation where we could go to them, cap in hand, and say, look, we want to buy a property in Suva for the union. Do you think you could lend us the money? And they said, well, if you've got a deposit. I said, well, we have got a deposit. We've got enough money left over from the All Black tour. Put down a deposit of, I think, $10,000 or whatever it was, but we needed to borrow about another 100.
Yes.
And our friendly bank came to the party, and we finished up with the dear old property we still have today, which isn't perhaps the greatest looking property in Suva, but it only cost $110,000 at the time, so I think we bought pretty well. Well, I would say that was an up and down process. We loved each other at times, we hated each other at times. And that's sort of part of the relationship, I think, between the three rugby nations. Strong adversaries, fought like devils on the field, off the field great mates. Yes, I think we sort of got out of... We kept a good relationship always with Tonga.
Yes.
Tonga had an up and down relationship with Samoa. They had they had terrible sort of struggles on the field occasionally. And one tour, I forget which it was, there was Tonga to Samoa or Samoa to Tonga. The tour broke down halfway through, and the visiting team went home in a huff.
Yes.
And relations got to a really low ebb.
Yes.
We didn't get to that stage, although we had a walk-off here once in a Samoa-Fiji game where I think it was the Samoan team walked off. We weren't at our best with Samoa. We did have a lot of arguments there, but we sorted it all out off the field.
Yes.
And when that tour broke up between Samoa and Tonga, they asked me, and I thought this was quite good of them. The Samoa and Tonga asked me if I would mediate in some way between Tonga and Samoa to get things back on the rails again.
Yes.
I took that as a compliment, really, that they wanted me to do that. So I went and had a meeting with the head of Tonga and the head of Samoan rugby. And I said, look, we've got to sort this out. We can't have this nonsense in the Pacific. And what I'm suggesting is that we have a round robin competition between the three countries on an annual basis.
Yes.
That we set up a competition that we will each play each other every year,
Yes.
and we'll have it home and away. We'll play. Tonga will play Fiji once in Tonga and once in Fiji. Samoa will play that way.
Yes.
Samoa will play once in Tonga, once in Samoa. So on. Everyone will have a home and away.
Yes.
That was the initial plan. Well, we got it partly done because I think we just got to the one round. I don't think we achieved that first year a home and away, but we at least achieved games between the three nations, and we got the thing going. And that was, to me, I had a great deal of pleasure in seeing that happen and getting us back on the track again and getting those relationships going again, because we're all very close together as rugby people.
Yes.
There's a huge bond between the Pacific countries in rugby. We're starting to see it now through the Super Rugby. It's blossoming out of the Drua and the other team that's developing there. The way that Pacific rugby is really adding something to South Pacific rugby. It used to be all about Australia and New Zealand. I think they've now finally realised that we are of some use to them after all.
Yes.
And hopefully that will grow as time goes on. Well, I personally think it's the best thing that's happened to Fiji rugby for a long, long time. And I have attempted to make it happen. I think one goes back through the records. I was looking at something just the other day. I'd written a letter to the editor of Rugby News in New Zealand around about 1990, I think it was, when our rugby was really at a pretty low ebb.
Yes.
And the union was broke, and there was really no way out of it. And I was putting it very strongly to Australia and New Zealand that it was really time that we thought about a tri-nations in the South Pacific. That was before we thought of the wider picture. That Fiji, which at that time I think was accepted by Tonga and Samoa as being the leading nation in the Pacific, that we would have at least an annual fixture against Australia and New Zealand.
Yes.
So we'd have a tri-nations there. Now that was the start of that idea of getting something going regularly. But what I wanted more than anything else was to get Samoa and Tonga into it as well, so that we had what I would call 5 nations. And I think at that time was even suggesting that Argentina might meet us, and we were probably way ahead of it then, because Argentina didn't join them until relatively recently. but that we could have what I called a seven-nation competition in the South Pacific. They could have their Six Nations up there, but we would have New Zealand, Australia, Argentina, Samoa, Tonga, and Fiji. Is that 6 or 7? Not sure now. I thought it came to 7. Maybe it's only 6.
Yes. The best thing that's happened.
I think it is.
Yes.
It's going to give us some balance now for our national team. At the moment, or up till now, or up till very recent times, our national coach has really had to pick his national team for the World Cup out of players in the Northern Hemisphere, simply because there have not been players in the Southern Hemisphere playing at the requisite level of rugby to fit them for World Cup rugby.
Yes.
Now, we played around with it a bit in our earlier years. At times we played dismally, at times we did quite well. But I think even in the most recent episodes, certainly in the World Cup in New Zealand, we didn't look so good. The one in Japan, at times we looked a little bit better, but overall it wasn't all that good.
Yeah.
So I think it meant that we had to get more depth into the experience of the players in the Fiji team.
Yeah.
And to achieve that, we really had to pick them out of the French clubs and the British clubs where they were playing top-class rugby.
Yeah.
Maybe there was an odd guy in New Zealand, an odd guy in Australia, might be able to pluck him. So there's no one locally who'd be up to the mark. But now
Yes.
we've got a situation where we're going to be playing through the Drua in a competition that I believe the Super Rugby in New Zealand is probably the best rugby competition in the world. And that compares with the British competition, the French top 14, you name it. You tell me where. And I would say that the top 6 teams in the Super Rugby will be better than any of them.
Yes.
They'll beat any of them.
Yeah.
And if we can get our feet into the water, so to speak,
Yes.
get into the trough with the best teams in New Zealand and the best teams of Australia, that's just going to get us better and better and better and better. Now, we won't see miracles immediately. I thought last year we performed extremely well.
Yes.
I thought to get a couple of wins in our first year was very, very good.
Yes.
And I had the greatest respect for the team. And I think this year we might be able to do one better. We'll just go a little bit better. Let's not get too optimistic. Let's not say we're going to knock over the Crusaders or anything silly, because that's not going to happen. But, we can get better. We can get better. And eventually we will knock over the Crusaders. Give us a few years.
Yes.
We'll knock over the Blues. We'll knock over the Chiefs. We'll knock over the Highlanders. And I firmly believe that.
Yes.
It's just a matter of maturity, exposure. That's what it's always been about.
Yes.
Rugby at test level has always been about exposure. And that's why I tried very hard. I tried as hard as I darn well could during my period in the rugby union in the 70s to get our players exposed to international rugby out there. So we were playing the All Blacks, we were playing the Wallabies, we were playing Wales, playing England, playing Ireland,
Yes.
I mean, that's the only way you can make your players better.
Yes.
We couldn't go and play at a Super Rugby, so what's the other option? We've got to play international rugby, don't we?
Yep.
We're going to get done over occasionally. We won't get beaten by 60 points by the All Blacks occasionally, but that's all part of the learning curve.
Right.
The All Blacks are not going to beat us by 60 points today. No way.
Yes.
Look at the shock we gave them last year down there. Look at the way we did a rolling maul and scored a try. Look at the way we got a penalty try against the All Blacks. No one would have dreamed of that happening.
Yes.
But you get Jason Ryan, a really top forward coach, stick him in there with our team, they can perform miracles.
Yes.
They can perform miracles. It's my mind back.
Yes.
And I carry a little bit of pride on this one because It was during my reign there as as chairman that this invitation came in from the Hong Kong Rugby Union, Hong Kong Rugby Union, and it invited us to take part in a seven-a-side competition in Hong Kong.
Right.
I think they wrote to us in 1975 or late 75 telling us it was going to happen in 76. So we had a little bit of time to think about it, not that much time. So I raised it with my executive committee and sort of seven-a-side, what the hell's seven-a-side? So then we had a guy called Brian Whiteman with us then, and Brian said, well, I know a bit about sevens. I played sevens in England, and I said, well, Brian, you can be in charge of sevens. You know all about it. The rest of us don't know anything about it. And I had played one game of sevens in my life. I forget what year it was, but one year in my my Auckland senior rugby life, we had a warm-up at the beginning of the season where some bright spark decided we were going to have a seven-a-side competition, and each club had to send in a seven-a-side team. And I was one of the idiots who was chosen to play sevens for Grammar Old Boys, and so I went in there, and I'd never been so totally stuffed in my life. You know, it was totally exhausted after it. I've never been so exhausted in my life, but that was my personal experience. Anyway, I said, how are we going to do this? And the consensus was, well, we should have a local tournament, a provincial tournament. We'll have a provincial tournament. We'll ask each of the main provinces, and we couldn't extend it to the minor unions. We said, we'll just stick with the major unions. So, Roa, Suva, Nadrigar, Nandi, Lautoka, Recollections, each send in a seven-a-side team. We're going to have a competition, and we'll see how we go. And from that, we select us, and we even nominated different. I was still a selector, I think.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether the Fiji selectors did it or whether we had different selectors. I said we'll pick a team from these trial games to go to Hong Kong. So I was happy about that. All expenses were being paid, no cost to us except assembling the team and getting them to Nandi Airport. So Rewa won the competition very well. They had a startlingly good team. And we decided, and I think I was one of the selectors, that we would send the whole of the Rewa team. They would go as Fiji. They would play as Fiji. And we took the whole of the Rewa team. We called Lautoka the captain coach. I said, Tui, you're the captain, but you're also the coach. And we had Tevita Rambuli and Tui Lavalati and Tevita, all those guys. Joe Roto, you know. They were a startling team, that seven-a-side. And we had, I recall, two outsiders, Tom Jani from Suva and one of the Ratchandra boys from Lautoka.
Yes.
They were the team that went to Hong Kong. So anyway, they went off, and as history will tell you, we got knocked out in the semi-final by Australia, who eventually won the tournament. But in that semi-final where we got knocked out, we had played two spells of extra time against Australia, with Joe Ralto ordered off and playing with six players in extra time, and we got through those two sessions, and Australia couldn't score against us. They eventually did. They won the semi, they went on and they won the final. So the next year, we got serious. We thought, well, we can darn well win this thing. So we really got serious. We had more trials and that, and they picked the team. It was a darn good side. Went over there, we won it. we won the thing.
Rest is history.
Rest is history, as I say. Now, I would be telling a lie if I said I was a fan of sevens rugby. Like good 15s men, I'll always be a 15s man. I'll always believe that the game of rugby is played by 15 men, not by 7 men. But there are two games. We have rugby, which is 15s, and we have sevens. And the two are totally different games. And let's always treat them as totally different games. Let's not get them mixed up together. Let's not think that a guy can play sevens who's going to be a good 15s player or vice versa. It's rubbish. There are people, horses for courses, and you're either a 15s player or you're a sevens player. And I think now the world has started to realise that. There used to be a time when New Zealand would send their lumbering All Blacks up to play in the sevens. They don't do it today. You got to have horses for courses. But as for sevens rugby generally, it is a wonderful thing for Fiji. A wonderful thing for Fiji. So don't get me wrong. When I say I'm a 15s man, I applaud sevens for what it is. I'm so proud of the boys who've been to the Olympics and won 2 gold medals. I think it's absolutely fantastic. It's great that we have won several World Cups. I wish we'd won a couple more, but that's beside the point. We've won a lot of other tournaments, whether Hong Kong or elsewhere. And I think it'd be a foolish man who ever said that Fiji is not the best seven-a-side team in the world. And that's despite the fact that we're going to lose the odd game here and there. There's going to be odd tournaments that we won't win. And who cares? They can't win them all. Even the All Blacks can't win them all. So I think it's been excellent for Fiji to be able to hold our heads up proudly as Olympic champions. That's a tremendous goal for anyone, any athlete, to have an Olympic gold medal. And let's hope that sevens prospers, but let's hope that at the same time 15s prospers. Because I'm afraid, and I say this advisedly, for a period of our history, and I don't need to go into the dates because I think everyone is well aware of them, we were playing brilliant sevens. We were winning Hong Kong sevens, and our 15 side was a disaster, a total disaster. And my explanation of that time was we are putting too much time into sevens and not enough time into 15s. Remember that 15s is the game that makes rugby. It's the World Cup rugby that matters. World Cup rugby is a lot more important than a gold medal at the Olympics. It's a lot more important. If we could ever one day win the World Cup rugby, that would be something fantastic for Fiji. And I believe that given time, we could get up there. I can remember, as I'm sure you can, the days when we used to have an East-West game, and we'd have it down at Albert Park, and it would be at night always, and we would have a curtain raiser between 2 women's teams, and they'd come out and they'd play a form of rugby that probably not too many people would call rugby, but it was highly entertaining, put it that way. Usually slopping around in the mud, because in those days Hibiscus Festival time was renowned for wet weather. So they were clambering around in the mud, but it was a far cry from real rugby. And that's all we knew about women's rugby. Now, I first encountered women's rugby on one of our tours to Britain. I think it was 1973, where we transited through Los Angeles on the way to UK, and we watched there, the team watched a game of women's rugby in Los Angeles. I was totally impressed. I couldn't believe that women could play rugby of that quality. They were playing it like men. They were going through all the motions. They were playing extraordinarily good rugby. And that was well before New Zealand or Australia, or certainly Fiji, really got into its act. I'm not quite sure when New Zealand and Australia came on board, but it was certainly after America. I think the movement started in America and Canada. I think they were the 2 first to start women's rugby. And of course, eventually it had to get here. And our girls, I'm sure last year, surprised everyone. They certainly surprised me. And I think anyone who says they weren't surprised would probably be telling a lie. but it was a nice surprise to see them playing the style of rugby they played, and to see that they were capable of playing up to and winning against those Australian girls in the Australian competition. And that's not an easy competition to win. Particularly the top teams like Queensland and New South Wales. I mean, there might have been 2 or 3 teams that weren't all that great, but the top teams are very, very strong sides. And for us to win that competition showed that we've got the girls that can make it up. Now, okay, in this last World Cup, we started learning the real facts of life, and that is that to get up there with the big girls, you've got to have a lot more experience and time in the game. We haven't had enough time in the game yet. But given time in the game and given exposure, which is the big thing, whether it's sevens or women's sevens or 15s, whatever, the key word in rugby is exposure. You've got to get it. And the more exposure we can get for our girls, fantastic. They're winning in the sevens, a silver medal. Sevens will always be our forte. Our sevens girl will always play better than the 15s girls will play. 15s girls will struggle along. They'll struggle along a bit. But our sevens girls, one of these days, they'll win the gold medal at the Olympics. They'll win the gold.